Everyone thinks the Blue Wizards failed, that they journeyed into the east of Middle-earth, vanished into obscurity, and were ultimately forgotten because they accomplished nothing. No great victories, no legendary kingdoms, no final stand against Sauron, just silence. But that's not what really happened, because hidden inside Tolkien's later writings is a possibility so strange, so unsettling, that it completely changes how we understand the war for Middle-earth. What if the Blue Wizards did not fail at all? What if they disappeared because they were fighting a war nobody in the West even knew existed? A war fought not for kingdoms, but for the survival of reality itself. Tonight we're talking about the true fate of the Blue Wizards, the mysterious Istari who walked into the East, and why Tolkien may have implied they prevented Middle-earth from collapsing long before Frodo ever carried the ring. At first glance, the Blue Wizards seem unimportant. Most people barely remember their names. Alatar, Pallando. Two figures mentioned briefly and then swallowed by mystery. Compared to Gandalf, they feel almost unfinished, and that's exactly why they're terrifying. Because Tolkien rarely leaves mysteries empty by accident, especially not cosmic mysteries. The deeper you look into Middle-earth, the more you realize something uncomfortable. History is written by survivors, and nearly everything we know about Tolkien's world comes from the perspective of the West, Gondor, Rivendell, the Shire. But beyond those lands stretched enormous civilizations most people never think about: the East, the South, the regions closest to Morgoth's ancient corruption, entire nations living beneath the shadow long before Sauron openly declared war. And according to Tolkien, that's where the Blue Wizards went, not to seek glory, but to resist something spreading silently across the world. Most people imagine the War of the Ring as the central conflict of Middle-earth, but this is where things get darker, because the war we witnessed may have been only one front in a far larger struggle. Think about it. Sauron's armies were massive, too massive. The populations of Mordor alone could never explain their numbers. The East constantly supplied him with soldiers, weapons, allies, worshippers. Entire civilizations marched beneath his banners. But Tolkien quietly hints at something shocking. Without the Blue Wizards, those armies may have become unstoppable. That changes everything, because suddenly the Blue Wizards stop looking irrelevant and start looking invisible, like two forgotten spies holding back an ocean while nobody remembers their names. This is where Tolkien becomes deeply philosophical. The Blue Wizards were not sent to dominate evil through force. That was never the purpose of the Istari. The wizards were forbidden from seeking power openly. They were meant to inspire resistance, to awaken courage, to guide rather than control. Like gardeners tending fragile fires in a world drowning in darkness. But that mission carried a hidden danger, because the East was different, far from the wisdom of the elves, far from the memory of Valinor, far from the ancient traditions protecting the West. Power operated differently there, and power changes people, especially isolated people. This is where things become disturbingly uncertain. In Tolkien's earlier writings, the Blue Wizards may have failed completely. Some versions suggest they founded secret cults, magic traditions, possibly even false religions. They may have become exactly what they were sent to oppose, corrupted not through obvious evil, but through the slow intoxication of influence. And honestly, that may be one of Tolkien's darkest ideas, because corruption rarely begins with hatred, it begins with certainty, the belief that only you know how the world should be saved. Saruman fell this way. Sauron fell this way. Even Morgoth believed he alone understood how existence should function, and isolated in the East, surrounded by frightened civilizations desperate for guidance, the Blue Wizards may have slowly transformed from helpers into rulers, like doctors becoming kings during a plague. But that's not what really happened, at least, not entirely. Because later in Tolkien's life, something changed. His final writings suggest a radically different possibility. The Blue Wizards succeeded, not publicly, not gloriously, quietly. Tolkien hints they traveled deep into enemy lands, sabotaging Sauron's influence from within, weakening alliances, disrupting rituals, preventing entire nations from joining the Dark Lord, and suddenly their disappearance becomes far more haunting. Because successful resistance often leaves no monuments, nobody builds statues for wars that never happened. Most people never realize this, but Middle-earth was terrifyingly close to total collapse. If the East had united fully under Sauron, Gondor would have fallen almost instantly. The West would have drowned beneath endless armies. Frodo's quest would have become meaningless before it even began, and somewhere beyond the maps, beyond the stories sung in Rivendell, two forgotten wizards may have been the reason that future never arrived. Think about the loneliness of that. Gandalf had allies, the Fellowship, ancient kingdoms. The blue wizards vanished into lands where almost nobody even remembered the valor existed. Imagine trying to resist Sauron inside territories where darkness had already become normal, where people no longer feared evil, because evil had become culture. This is where things get darker. Because Tolkien implies the East was psychologically different from the West, not inherently evil, but exhausted. Civilizations shaped by generations of fear, conquest, and survival, and the blue wizards entered that world carrying almost impossible responsibilities to oppose darkness without becoming tyrants themselves. That's an incredibly fragile line, like carrying fire through a forest during a drought. And maybe that's why Tolkien leaves their fate uncertain, because uncertainty itself becomes the point. The blue wizards represent a terrifying truth about moral struggle. Sometimes you fight battles nobody will ever know existed. No songs, no recognition, no proof you succeeded at all. Only silence. And this is where the story becomes almost painfully human. Because the blue wizards may symbolize every forgotten resistance in history, every person who prevented disaster without receiving credit, every sacrifice erased by time because catastrophe never occurred. We celebrate visible victories, but invisible victories are stranger, haunting. The disaster that never happened leaves behind no ruins, only absence, and absence is difficult to remember. This is why Tolkien's later interpretation feels so emotionally devastating. The blue wizards may have saved Middle-earth and still vanished from history completely. Not because they failed, but because success erased the evidence they were ever needed. That idea is almost horrifying. To speed centuries fighting darkness in forgotten lands, only for the world to forget your existence entirely. But Tolkien pushes the philosophy even deeper. Because the blue wizards reveal something unsettling about evil itself. Evil spreads fastest in neglected places, in lands abandoned by memory, abandoned by wisdom, abandoned by hope, and the east of Middle-earth was exactly that. Not merely geographically distant, spiritually distant. The further civilizations moved from truth, the easier they became vulnerable to domination. And Sauron understood this perfectly. He did not simply conquer people, he filled vacuums. That's why the blue wizards mattered. They were sent not as conquerors, but as interruptions, tiny fractures in the machinery of despair. Most people never realize Tolkien's world survives because of small acts almost nobody sees. A hobbit carrying a ring, a ranger guarding forgotten roads, two lost wizards whispering resistance beyond the edge of the map. The fate of Middle-earth was never determined only by kings. It depended on unseen people resisting corruption in silence. And maybe that's why the blue wizards remain mysterious, because Tolkien understood something deeply uncomfortable.